is Julian Schlossberg. He's a producer. He produced major motion pictures with the who's who in filmmaking, both on New York and on the West Coast. He produced for Broadway and has earned 6 Tonys, 2 Obies, 7 Drama Desk Awards, and 5 Critics Circle Awards. He also produced record albums for some of the biggest recording artists in the business. And in addition to that, he also produced his own radio show, which was heard in major markets for 9 years. That's amazing just in itself. Anyway, please welcome my guest, Julian Schlossberg. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Stewart. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we even get into anything, I want to ask you one question. Can you explain what a producer does?
Well, it's kind of interesting because the public is, by this time, must be confused when they see 75 names up there.
Yeah.
But a real producer, a true producer, a lead producer, if you will, finds the property, hires the director, of course, has to raise the money, works with the writer and the director on the project, gets involved in the casting, as in charge of the advertising, the marketing, the publicity. It's a full-time job, and very few people even choose to do it, and those who do are considered an endangered species.
That's a lot of work. I always thought if you have the money, you make yourself the producer, you hire a director, and then you wait for the premiere.
Well, there are a lot of producers who work exactly the way you described it, but that, for me, that's no fun.
Julian has joined me today because he's just put out a book called Try Not to Hold It Against Me. And you talk about, in your book, you talk about growing up on the streets of the Bronx. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, you know, it was a different time, Stu, as you probably know, because you were growing up in the Bronx as well. It was a more innocent time, and it was more about neighborhoods than it is now. It was a fun time. I'm very glad that I had it. But, you know, I'll go to friends' homes with children, and they don't know what a butcher is. They don't know what a butcher is. I mean, come on, you know, because we had the candy store, we had the deli, we had all these local stores that you went to, and it was pretty terrific.
I gave you a big introduction and having success in many of the genre that's called the entertainment business. How did you get started?
Well, I'd like to say one thing. You know, the first thing I realized was the fact that I was not going to have a medical degree or a law degree or an accounting degree. I better learn as much as I could about the motion picture, television, theater business, record business. I felt knowledge was power. And I decided to study and do as best I could in all those fields. And at the time, I was only starting at the ABC network. I started as an account representative. I was part of a team that did make goods. ABC at that time was about the 7th network, even though there were only 3. NBC and CBS owned everything. And we were in charge of, if something was preempted or cut off, we were in charge of not giving the money back to the advertisers, but to convince them to do a make good, to come and play in another time slot. So that was my beginning at $90 a week. And I was sent to the BBC on a transfer for a couple of weeks. It was supposed to be a couple of months, but I got there. And in those days, they had telexes. I don't even know if some of the listeners know what a telex is, but we had a telex, and it came and said, come back, you've been promoted. Wow. I came back, and now I was in charge of an office of 4 men and myself. It was a great beginning, though, because I learned a lot about television, and then I went to a television syndicator, which meant that I was selling movies all over the United States. And that was exciting to go on someone else's dime and learn the country, because they hired me to take the stations that nobody wanted.
You left that business and you got involved with the Broadway stage, and you won all of these awards. How do you just, what do? You walk into the theater and say, I'm here, teach me the business, and then you produce shows?
Well, that's a very good question, and very simply, you if you're a producer and you've raised the money for the show, you have a general manager who hopefully is good, and they teach you the business. As I said earlier, I also had learned a lot of the business, even though I wasn't in it.
And after you got involved on the stage, you went into the recording business and did record albums for Judy Collins and James Taylor and Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Did you have any stars?
Well, I was very fortunate. I made a movie called No Nukes with an enormous amount of famous rock and rollers who that starting with Bruce Springsteen. But it was Bruce Springsteen and Tom Petty and enormous Jackson Brown and Crosby, Stills and Nash and James Taylor and Carly Simon. And I met a friend named Danny Goldberg who had run major record companies. And we hit it off. And we were the co-producers and co-directors. And he said, look, let's have dinner and let's talk about what we're going to do when it's all over. And at this dinner, I said, look, I have a company that picks up movies that people don't want, but have stars or quality. Is there anything like that? Anything like that in the record business? And he said, yeah, there is. There are people who are famous, but are not recording. And he went out, not me. He went out and got those stars.
Wow. You would think that people of that stature would have no trouble and be recording all the time. You've worked with the biggest names and the most powerful people in show business. I know how powerful people behave outrageously sometimes. How are you able to deal with these people and get what you needed to get from them without making yourself crazy?
Well, there may be people who think I have made myself crazy. But no, I would say that I was interested in some actors who are very famous, doesn't matter whom, would say to me, I would go to them and I would say, what do you want from a producer? And they'd literally go back in their chair. What do you mean? I said, what do you expect from a producer? And one of the biggest things they said was, don't lie to us. Just don't lie to us. Well, I thought, well, I can do that. I don't have to. I don't have to lie. I'm capable of it, but I'm not going to. And that seemed to be a very interesting way to convince people that you were sincere and trying to be helpful. All I asked from the actors often was just to know your lines, and whatever your complaints are, make it about the project, not about you. If you're unhappy with, let's say, the costume that you have, or you don't feel that you're being given the right thing in a scene, and then I'll go and talk to the director on your behalf. But make it about the project and not your ego.
So you're really like a diplomat.
I tried. I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with and write about some of the finest people who have the talent, and also about the misses. The idea of just writing about success is silly. First of all, nobody has nothing but success. And secondly, sometimes the misses, when you're a producer, mean more to you than the successes. You put so much into that particular piece, and it didn't make it. I have never gotten over, to this day, and it's 7-8 years ago, I produced Bullets Over Broadway, the musical. Susan Stroman, a Tony Award-winning director and choreographer, a wonderful talent. Woody, no matter what anyone's going to say, no one's going to deny his talent. And we had exactly on that stage what I wanted. And I thought to myself, well, looks like you're going to finally hit the big gold ring. And a couple of months later, I had to close. So that's one of the hardest things, Stewart, when you're going to close.
How do you get over that? And how long does it take to recuperate from something like that so that you can move forward?
Well, one of the things as a producer that you have to do is always have a bunch of projects in development.
You've got a project, I read about this, called Major Historical Events in the 20th Century. What will it be about, and what could the audience expect?
Well, it's called Witnesses to the 20th Century.
Okay.
And I was able to interview 140 of the most extraordinary people on the planet Earth. I started with President George H.W. Bush, and I got Sandra Day O'Connor, and then I got people like Clint Eastwood and Angela Lansbury. Obviously, some of them have passed on. And I also, because I've represented Mike Nichols and Elaine May for many years, Elaine is writing and directing 14 hours that we're doing. And the 14 hours start with 1900 and we go to 1999. And we go with people who not only lived the 20th century, have people who have been around for 70, 80 years of that, and talk about how the major events of the 20th century affected them, but conversely, how they affected many of those events.
What do you do with your spare time?
Well, I think like you, my avocation and my vocation kind of come together.
Well, I've run out of questions to ask you, so I guess this is the time when we should say goodbye.
Thank you for that lovely sentence, and I hope you have a good week.
Okay, and this was fun. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.